Good morning. I'll call the meeting to order and look for an adoption of the agenda. Deputy Mayor Richardson, seconder. Councillor McDonald, all in favor? Thank you, and that's passed. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest on the agenda for today? Seeing none, should any arise during the course of the meeting, advise the chair and we will deal with them accordingly. We have no deputations, we have no correspondence, so we'll move right into the 2023 budget overview by department, and we'll have introductory remarks on the 2023 departmental budget overview. Ron Taylor, Chief Administrative Officer, Carolyn Daines, Treasurer, and Adam Found, Manager of Corporate Assets. Over to you, Mr. CAO.
It's great. Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the introductions, and looking forward to a full day of providing you with some updates and overview predominantly focused on departments today. You'll remember back in December, it was the 13th, we kicked off the budget more broadly, just giving you a very high-level sweeping overview of all of the budgets that you're going to be deliberating over the next approximate 2 months. And so, again, the focus for today is to really kickstart the information exchange. It's an opportunity for you to ask questions. It's not the only opportunity, though. We're hoping that you will be comfortable to ask us, reach out to departments. We'll have a process that we're going to talk about as we get into deliberations of each budget as well. So we want to make sure that you've got all of the information that you need to make an informed decision on the budgets ongoing. And so, first of all, before we get into the departments, just a couple of sort of opening remarks. First of all, I do want to introduce our small but mighty financial team. It was mentioned in the agenda, and I'm only introducing a couple of them. Obviously, it extends out broadly within departments and in the corporate services area. But Carolyn Daines is our treasurer, and she's been a constant sort of and ongoing, obviously, in our budgets for several years. And her focus is predominantly on the operating budget, but it's all finances. So she's our expert on debt, on reserves, and just our overall financial management day to day and operating budgets in particular. Well, that doesn't mean she doesn't have a focus on every line item in every budget that we have. And Dr. Adam Found is the manager of corporate assets. And by title, his focus is really on those corporate assets. Maintaining them, their life cycles, funding for them. So his focus is predominantly on the capital budget. But I know being a finance and math keener, he likes to look at the broader view as well on all of our budgets. And what I think is really strong with this sort of team is it connects us to our plans. And before you would sort of go through annual budget cycles, sort of see what the conditions are that you're entering into. And as you can appreciate, these are quite large, complex budgets. So just as soon as you're finished one, you're starting the next one, you're spending in between, and there's really a lot of overlap with them as well. But I think what I would suggest or just highlight sort of two pieces that have really guided this budget. One is our long-term financial plan. You've heard a bit about that, and we'll be talking about that ongoing. And the second is our asset management plan. And again, if we don't know what we have and where it's at and if it needs improvements and what that costs, how do you plan for such a massive portfolio? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. And I do want to acknowledge Sherry Anderson. She was the former EA in corporate services, and she was behind the scenes building all of these documents, maintaining and putting together the budget book for us, and a liaison sort of out to other departments, and she did a fantastic job. So you heard on December 13th that the proposed budgets that are in front of you are coming in to plans. 3% budget increase is proposed. There's an additional 1.5% capital levy to invest back into our capital assets. And again, I'll mention why later. But again, all in keeping with our long-range financial plans. I mentioned at the December 13th budget overview that honestly, it was no easy feat, in my opinion. We're seeing other municipalities throughout Ontario and even more broadly. This sort of post-pandemic state, high inflation. We've got delays in goods and services, acquiring them, so supply chain issues, people constraints and shortages right across several industries. And all this adds up to anticipated higher costs. We're already seeing them in some of the tendering and purchasing that we're doing. And prolonged cycle times. And time is money in some cases, and you know that phrase. And so we're really struggling with both of those. But having said all of that, I'm quite proud and pleased that we are coming in at the proposed budget, that we are sort of on target. But we were facing double-digit inflationary numbers and costs, and we were able to come in at least proposed at targets. You're going to hear also that with all of this sort of environment that has been ongoing and we're entering into even more so, we need to continue, and we're going to recommend to build in the budgets savings and reserve building. And it's not simply for now a rainy day necessarily. It's starting to spit out there. Like it's at a point where those costs are coming in at 10 and 20% higher. And you've only got two ways to go. If you don't have the savings to top it up, you got to reduce your spending on the other side. So you get less projects done overall in any given capital budget year. And just maybe certainly for some of the new members, but when I also say it's quite a feat to go through this budget, although we feel small rural municipality, in the bigger picture and in the province, we're quite a large operation. We're quite a large single-tier municipality to manage, both in actual size, our budgets, and our people. We have, as you know, over 3,000 square kilometers of area that we're trying to cover, many urban and rural centers, and everything in between. Over 5,300 kilometers of lane roads. You've heard this before, and I know you've heard on your campaign trails interest in roads. But it's not an easy feat to try to tackle and stay ahead of the quality of those 5,300 kilometers of lane road. Our population is now starting to leap forward and increase. We're exceeding 80,000 people now, permanent residents. Don't want to forget that there's also another 25,000 plus seasonal residents that come into the city for a given period of time and contribute as well. And then just to give you some sort of highlights, you heard this generally on December 13th, but our capital budget proposed this year exceeds $56 million, an additional $2 million in our special projects, $30 million on our user rate, water and wastewater budgets all combined, and a $236 million operating budget. So you are the managers, as well as all of staff and administration, of combined budgets exceeding $300 million in a given calendar year. So it's never an easy feat, but I think collectively both council and administration are certainly up to the challenge. So, Mr. Mayor, I wanted to now just focus very briefly. I had sent a note out to all of council, and I just wanted to update on that in terms of key dates for the budget process overall. But I think it's probably good in the public venue to highlight those as well. So, as I mentioned, we're kicking off the budgets today with this special council meeting. So you're going to hear from 6 of 9 city departments today. Again, very high-level overviews, trying to get you information and educated on how these departments connect into the budget that you're looking at. The following week, next week, January 26th, we'll have an additional all-day special council meeting. That will conclude presentations from 3 other operating departments in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we've invited all of our funded agencies, boards, and committees to do presentations to council to provide information on their 2023 budget requests. And so that'll round out the month of January from a budget perspective. And then on February 2nd, in the evening, you'll host a public meeting, a special council meeting, where we'll hear from other interest groups, community groups, and individual residents providing comments and commentary and recommendations on all of the budgets. And then we will go into February. You'll deliberate sort of in two phases. The first will start February 14th, and that is solely focused on the capital budget. And there's a day session planned there. There's additional dates if more time is required. And then 2 weeks later, starting on February 28th, you'll deliberate and review the remaining budgets. So special projects, operating budget, and the user rate water wastewater budgets. In between, we'll send you instruction and information. Again, if you have any questions formally, then we can sort of review them as departments and provide you with responses in a timely manner and in advance of those meetings, ideally, so you have the best information available to you. I think it's also important that the process, you're going to share those questions with your colleagues so that when we respond to questions, it's provided to all of council. So you all have the same information as well. And I'm sure some of the questions are the same for individuals. I think that covers the overall process, but maybe I will pause there just briefly if council has any general questions to start, just in terms of process or anything that I've opened up with.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess this is a question that comes up all the time, especially with new councils and you know, getting 2022 actuals, which is very difficult because it hasn't been audited yet. But is there a way to get a kind of rough guesstimate towards the end of the process so we know where we are before we approve the final approval?
Great question. I'm glad you flagged it. And through you, Mr. Mayor, and maybe Carolyn will want to supplement, but what we try to do is sort of best efforts when we get to the operating stage, so by the end of February. Again, I won't pin down our treasurer to actuals, but we will try to make best efforts to get a general estimate of where our 2022 position is so that you can make some additional decisions in 23. I would note this is a unique year because typically you would be deliberating capital in November of a given calendar year and operating in December. So it's even tighter, I'll say, to give you a good estimate. But having said that, in this particular year, we'll make best efforts to provide you with an estimate. I don't know if Carolyn, did you have anything you want to add? You good? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Coming from the private sector, there's a few columns that I'm accustomed to that aren't here. In the one column would be change from budget would be a percentage, not just dollar values. I find that very helpful in making comparisons. The other thing is 2021 was, shut down COVID year, so I fully respect there's going to be some huge swings. For example, training is much larger in 2023 than in 2021. Why? Because we're going back to in-person training, and staff, when they go to a conference, want to eat, surprisingly. So, versus everything was online and Zoom back in 2021. The other thing is I'd like to see 5-year trends. So if we could get 2018 and 2019, those were pre-COVID, and we can sort of see a better picture, if that's possible.
To you, Mr. Mayor, I'm just making notes on these sort of recommendations and suggestions at this point. We'll take those back to our team and sort of find out when we start to deliberate actual budgets, what information we can provide and follow up. So lastly, just before we get into the department updates themselves, I'm going to ask our treasurer, Carolyn Danes, just to walk you through the actual budget book itself. I think it's important that you have some familiarity with it. What are the different sections, sort of listing. We also issued, hopefully everybody has a copy in front of them, of a memo with some amendments to the budget book itself. So I would encourage you, as Carolyn is going through the updates in the sections, we'll actually update the budget with you in real time. So I'm going to just turn it over to Carolyn. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. So we have the budget book in front of us, and our first thing is the table of contents. So the table of contents relate to the tabs that you see on the side. So tab 1 would be the budget summary by revenue and expense, and tab 2 would be the budget summary by department. And then you go through all the departments as you see, and then, so this is all operating at the very beginning. And then we turn to water and wastewater, which is a different budget from our operating budget because it is user rate funded, fully user rate funded, nothing to do with the tax levy. And then we start in with the capital budgets after that. Oh, excuse me, we start on number 14 is the water and wastewater capital budget, and then we come to the tax levy supported capital budget. So as I'm going through this, I'm going to ask you to insert your changes. Just because makes sense to do so, and then everyone's on the same page. So our first amendment is on page 13. It starts on the memo. It says 14, but you're replacing 13 as well. So this is our consolidated just operating budget. Just includes the operating budget. So you're going to take out 13. 15, let's see, 13 to 17, and you're going to replace it. And I'm going to tell you why there were amendments on this page. And probably one of the things that you noticed on the old budget was that our contracted services looked pretty wacky on page 16. There's an amount for professional fees. The actual for 2021 was 4.3 million. The budget for 2022 was 3.6 million, and the budget for 2023 was 18.4 million. So you would probably say, what the heck's going on? Who are we contracting out? So what that was the Manor, Victoria Manor budget comes to us as a two-liner. So it just comes in with revenue and expenses. And you would have noticed as well that the miscellaneous revenue probably looked a little wacky as well. So what I did, and I did it for 2022, was I converted the Manor two-liner into a full budget based on city accounts. So now the Manor is dispersed where it should be into wages and all their expenditures and grants, which is primarily their revenue source. It didn't change the bottom line because I made sure that the net figure of the two lines equaled the net figure of all the lines in the Manor budget. There were a few other little changes, but they weren't as obvious as that one. So our tab 2 just gives the same budget, but by department, which is what all the other tabs are separated out as. So you can see what the budget looks like by department and how it increases or decreases from the previous year. So as you can see, we're not replacing anything in this budget because nothing changed overall. The Manor still sits at, on page 21, the Manor still sits at a $2.3 million tax levy impact. So then we move on to our corporate items review, which is basically, it holds our tax levy. It's really an overall revenue that we receive that really doesn't fit into any one department. So there'd be taxation in there. We receive a Ontario Municipal grant from the province. That's one of our major grants of 7.6 million. There's some federal gas tax and other sort of things in there. And this is where our debt and our capital tax levy sits as well. So there's nothing to change in those sections. And then we just start going through all of the sections
and you'll see that you'll get a little bit of a department overview on each department. You will see the organizational chart for each department, as well as you'll see in the mayor one, there's only one department summary, but in the other ones, there will be division summaries as well. There'll be an overall summary for the whole department, and then there'll be division summaries as well. So we don't see anything. Okay, so I want to draw your attention to engineering, because it's the first one I noticed that had something different in it. Page 103 and tab 9. So engineering and corporate assets is a department in the city. They've described what each department does. They've given you any sort of budget pressures or budget to priorities that they have. And then their personnel breakdown is on here. And this is the first one where there's actually a FTE increase. So you'll see that the full-time in 2022 was 28 of FTE, and the full-time in 2023 was 29 for a change of 1. And then they'd have additional hours. Those additional hours are part-time and seasonal hours. And then as well, they have student hours, and those were no change. But you go to the org chart, and you'll see that there's a color on that org chart, and that means that there's an additional position. So that's the first time you'll see that throughout all the departments up to that point. So I just wanted to point that out. And then as you can see, they kind of give a budget overview. They give the whole summary of the department. Again, org chart. Then they get into the various divisions that they have. And each one will have an org chart included. So we'll go to the next edition, which is page 132. I won't go through every department because they're all the same. I just wanted to make that note that did. If you see the colored in the org chart, that means that it's an addition to an FTE. So we're going to go and pull 132 to 134 out, and this is, again, is the human services. Yes. So actually it's 131. 131 to 134 comes out. And the same goes, the 132.1 to 132.4 goes in, and 34.1. So this is and you'll see in this one as well, we might as well note while we're here that there are additions to their FTEs in the human services area, noted by the color on the org chart. So this again would change, the human service area would change because of the manner breakdown that I did, as well as there was one business unit in the department that we missed. It was a new business unit. It was new funding actually for childcare, for the $10 a day childcare, and it was not included in the initial run of the budget book. So that's what changes there. So the human services should look a lot better as well, because it would have shown some really high contracted services as well as high other revenue. So we'll get rid of that. Okay, so our next change is in the same section, and it's going to be 137, I believe. I've lost my way here. Yeah, 137 to 138.1. So take those out and add your new sheets. So this change came about, as I just explained, for the 100% grant-funded childcare that just came from the province that we inadvertently missed when we were putting the budget book together. So then you can change as well in the same section. Sorry, Cheryl, we really kind of messed you up, didn't we? Page 139 and 140 come out, and 139 and 140 go in. So here, this is the the manor. So now you'll see that the manor is all split out, whereas before you would have seen the two lines in the former book, or in the former pages. Okay. So then we're going to go on to Public Works, I believe, yes. So we go to page 149, this is tab 12. 149, 150, 151.1. Yes, exactly, yep. Okay. So what changed here, and this was my error, I will say, I had done a few uploads incorrectly, so it just changed the contracted services and the materials. Okay. So then we're going to make changes to the roads and bridges on page 155. Typically what we do, and because I was off on sick leave, we didn't get a chance to do this, we break down the roads budget between roads and winter control. So I did that when I came back, so we replaced those pages with the new ones. And I don't see them, I'll figure it out later. So now you can see that the roads and bridges is split out between, we give you a summary, and then it's split out between just roads and then winter control as well. Okay, and then finally on page 216, so now we're going into, oh sorry, I'll go through the water and wastewater budgets on page 163, which is tab 13. So this budget is separated out from our regular operating budget because it is funded totally by the user rate. And you'll note that on page 164, we split it out between the water systems and the wastewater systems. And we do have a water and wastewater rate study done. So rates are actually projected forward for how many years, Adam? 5? 10? 10 years. And it's typically a 3% increase in water, so water and wastewater. Wastewater revenue is a function of the water revenue. So then you see the same descriptions. It's pretty consistent throughout. You'll see the org charts, you'll see the full-time hours in each department, and then it's split out in a more detailed basis. And then we have the water and wastewater capital budget. So this is built into the rate study is when we get the study finished, we build in a reserve contribution to the water and wastewater reserves so that those reserves are used for the capital budget. And as well, if there is some debenture funding usually in the water and wastewater budget. However, this year, it does not appear that we used any debenture funding, no debenture funding. So we used our water reserves and our sewage reserves, which are, building up over the years to a nice balance actually, but, still wanting to keep those reserves in place for any major work that is unanticipated for sure. So then Adam goes into, you'll have your summary page, then he goes into detail and they refer back to the summary page. So your 99-82301 on page 171 relates to a breakdown of all the projects that are in that capital project on page 172, and so on. So now we go, there's no amendments for those pages. So now we go into the capital budget. So Adam's going to give you a list here at the beginning on page 179 of all the capital needs that were present, that really needed to go ahead, but we're deferring them. So we want you to be aware that there were some projects that were on the schedule, but we're deferring them to the next year simply because we just don't have enough money to do all of them. So we've deferred quite a few to future years, and that goes on through page to page 186. So then we start on page 187 with the summary of our 2023 tax-supported capital budget, which is summarized. So each, again, is the same as the water and wastewater capital budget. You'll see on page 187 at the top there, 99,92301 is our multi-year capital projects. And so when you go and look for the detail, you'll see them on page 190 of all the projects that we're going to do in that summary project. And the same with every line on this summary capital budget. On 187, you'll see the same detail behind that. And it just goes on, and then you can see, actually, maybe I should note that on the summary page, on page 187, you'll see the sources of funding that we're going to be using for the capital budget. The asset management reserve is our major funder. What that is basically the capital levy that we put forth from the tax levy in order to fund the capital projects. We have some DC reserve funding, which is more for growth projects. So if you see DC reserves, you know that there's a portion that's growth. We spend our federal gas tax reserve and our provincial gas tax reserves on capital for roads, and then our provincial gas tax reserve is used for transit. We have fleet reserves, which is money that we put away every year for fleet, and then the reserves are used to fund all our fleet purchases. There's other little reserves in there that we pull from, and we have grants that come in, as well as our debenture that we will be going. We only debenture when the project's finished, so this is basically just saying that the money is going to be debentured when that project is finished. Okay, so then our next replacement is our page 216 to 18. And that is fire. And I'm not sure what happened there, Adam. What was that one?
It's for fire.
Yeah, what happened with fire?
It's just to correct the transposition and numbering.
Okay, to correct a transposition and numbering for fire. I've lost my summary. I don't know if you guys are confused, but I've lost my summary. But anyway, that's okay. Just a second here. Okay. Yes, and so that's our final change. So then as we go forward, so we go through all the capital budget, then we have on tab 16, we have special projects. So special projects are projects that aren't capital in nature, but they're more of they require more than a year to complete. So if we put these in operating every year, we have to reconcile the operating budget, so the funding would be lost in the bottom line. So we preserve the funding by putting it as a special project, and they're mostly studies and various one-time projects that don't reoccur, and we put them, they're operating, they're not going to result in a capital asset, and we put them in a special project so that that funding can go on for however long it takes for them to complete the project. For both capital and special projects, we do have a timeline restriction on completing a project. We, with COVID, that was kind of went out the doorway a little bit, but we try to ask project managers to complete their projects within 18 months. Okay, and on tab 17, we have our reserves and deferred revenue. So this is a complete list of all of our reserves that we've built up over the years. We do use these for funding for operating and capital. Some are specific to various usages that council has put aside. Some are legislated, such as the Development Charge Reserve Fund and the Parkland in lieu, that those things can only be, those reserves can only be used for certain purchases. But our goal, as the CAO stated, is to build these reserves. Certainly helps us finance things into the future. Tab 16, we've always, in council in the past has always had questions about interfunctional adjustments, is one of the lines you'll see on your consolidated and throughout all of the department budgets. And we just explain what interfunctional adjustments are. We do some administration or corporate services allocations out to various funded agencies in order to capture some extra grant funding. But there's also some debt financing and that sort of thing in there as well. And then finally, we have tried to put together on page, the tab being tab 19 and page 243, we've tried to give you categories that relate to the various items you'll see on the department budgets as well as the consolidated statements. So we've given you things that fall under each line, in case you're wondering what contracted service is or material is. And that is the review of the budget book. Hope you found it helpful.
Thank you. Everybody okay with that? Looks like it, so Mr. Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And so just wrapping up on that budget update, we will be also posting these revisions on the city's website for the public or for your viewing too, if you prefer sort of electronic. But we just wanted to make sure that you had the most up-to-date, best information in advance and leading into certainly your deliberation dates. So thanks for that and your patience sort of walking through the budget book itself. So let's shift the focus for today on department updates. So it's intended, as I mentioned in the opening, to provide you with a snapshot and overview of our 9 operating departments. They're all very much somewhat the same, but very much different in many other ways. And as you can appreciate, they are delivering on a portfolio of over 200 programs and services. We're going to be talking predominantly in some of the highlights upcoming, more operating focused. There are some departments that manage the majority of the capital projects, so we would highlight some of those as well. And it's really, again, just to give you an initial snapshot and information. Departments will try to answer questions on the spot today as best we can, but sort of appreciate there's a lot of information that's going to be coming at you over the next 2 months. And so I did mention that if we can't answer it today, we'll do one thing. We'll take it back to those departments. We will summarize what your question was. So we'll be making notes all day and other sessions. And then we want to publish those questions and we want to share the answers with all of you. So again, you have the best information and it's consistent information. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to start with the Mayor and Council, and then I'll talk about my specific administration department. And as you can appreciate, the Mayor and Council requires a supporting budget. You don't have a really defined department per se, but you certainly are supported through my department and the clerk's office. There's both legislative supports and just otherwise. So I'm going to take you through an overview. And again, if you have any questions for me or for the mayor, please feel free to ask. So we'll go to the next slide. And some of this won't be new information to you, but again, I think it's important through you. We really want to update the public on what we do in our different departments and programs. And so, as you know, this current council, new. This is the first budget that you'll be deliberating as a collective group. You're comprised of a mayor and 8 ward councillors. And again, you're still in the first year of the term, but they're 4-year terms spanning 2022 to 2026. Council has very specified roles, and later in the year, and ongoing, we'll be doing a number of orientation sessions with you so that you understand sort of what is the expected roles and responsibilities of individuals as well as of council and then the organization as a whole. Essentially, council is responsible to set expectations and you set service levels. And you do that through a number of levers, through policy development, and there's a number of policies that you review and support during each term of council. You pass bylaws, you pass resolutions, and probably most importantly, you approve budgets. And it's in those budgets that you are setting service levels and the programs for any given calendar year. I certainly don't need to tell this group that one of your core responsibilities is to represent the interests of your constituents and the general public right across the entire city. And other items you are expected to establish, approve, support, and monitor the city's strategic plan. So you're setting priorities overall for the community over your term of council. And we will be going through an exercise with a number of touch points to develop a future strategic plan. And the mayor has responsibility and oversight for the mayor and council operating budget overall. So we'll go to the next slide, and I want to talk a little bit, and this is going to be a consistent update to you. We want to touch on some highlights from the previous term of council, 2022 essentially, as a wrap up from the previous, and then we'll talk a little bit about 2023 highlights, objectives, priorities by department, and then we're going to conclude in our updates on some of the budget pressures within those departments specifically. And so as a new council, certainly there's some big issues that are top of mind in the community, and I think this term of council you'll have a strong focus on, which continues to be pandemic response and recovery. It's in different iterations in terms of response, but certainly recovery and post-pandemic, continued support, whether it's economic or community supports, and how things progress in a post-pandemic state, I think is going to be a main focus of you. The other piece of that is what are the new service expectations coming out of the pandemic? What did we learn? What did we do during the last 2.5 years? Some of those practices should remain. Others, we may need to go back to pre-pandemic. So I think you are also going to be looking at sort of a new suite of, establishing service levels and really trying to understand expectations more broadly of the public in a post-pandemic state. I mentioned that in the last term, it really started predominantly, but I think it is a critical approach that each council takes, which is looking in the longer term for financial planning. And again, we can look at any given year, and I can walk you back through the last 4, and I can guarantee that in each year the budget pressures were different. Some were consistent, but it was all over the place. And so if we don't look to the future and the long term and try to find sort of stable funding, stable budgets, and set ourselves up that way, we'll be operating in a more chaotic sort of approach, very reactive approach in any given year. And I think the other one, I mentioned it sort of post-pandemic, but it's sort of re-engaging with the public. It's been a tough, almost 3 years now. And certainly there's new ways to connect with the public. I don't want to paint a negative picture because quite frankly, in some cases, we have had never more public engagement in certain issues or attending sort of meetings, getting information from council. And I think those are other lessons that we need to capitalize on and learn ongoing. So a couple of things I want to mention sort of with these themes. A proactive pandemic response ongoing, although it feels like, and you've heard, post-pandemic, new normal, we are constantly internally still responding to things, whether that's with staff, with buildings and facilities, with the public and those interactions. And so we're going to continue to maintain our strong local health partnerships that we've established even pre-pandemic, but really leaned on during. We're going to keep looking at local conditions because things can change, as you can appreciate. And again, we want to do that while still managing sort of public demand, public expectations, as well as our staff. And we want to still concurrently look to post-pandemic recovery. The last term of council started a number of task forces focusing on economic and community relief. A lot of those recommendations are still ongoing and are entrenched in our upcoming budgets. But we need to stay consistent. We need to get the pulse of the business community, our residents, and make sure that fees and charges, how we invest our budgets as well to maximize recovery. So things like investing in our downtowns, where our small businesses are supporting the economy. So there are things that municipalities can do other than just simply sort of one-time relief funding. And I think infrastructure is the biggest, and it's important, and we need to look at strategically investing where and how. And it goes beyond, council's role goes beyond sort of what's in our budgets. You're our local advocates. And so we have a province that we work within. There's structures and funding associated with that. But you're the voice of our local community. And so those advocacy efforts and ongoing support of other partners that invest in our community, to me, is critical. And so you've heard, and we sensed it through the pandemic, things like broadband investments. That's not in our immediate portfolio, but if we can help support or incent expanded investment in areas like that infrastructure. Natural gas is one that's being extended now to other communities. A community care campus is being built locally. The Ross Memorial Hospital is looking at a capital campaign and expansions ongoing. And these are just a few. These are pillars in our community, and although they're not in our direct jurisdiction, we need to support them. And with the long-term financial planning, as I mentioned, we need to look at the long term, but there are certain things inherent to that I think we've done a great job over the last 4, 5, 6 years, and I think needs to be continued. So we want to review our debt. We want to look at how we take on debt. We want to do it properly. We want to look at reserves. We don't want to build reserves just for the sake of building reserves, but we need to build them for either a rainy day or, as I mentioned, we're going to have years where, like this year, where we have cost pressures. And again, we either have to draw from something or we have to pare down what capital we can accomplish. And we're already in a deep trench in terms of getting ahead of our capital and our overall assets, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The one thing I mentioned in December, I think it was an absolutely fantastic direction, quite frankly, from the previous term of council. I'm thrilled that this council supports it, was the direction during the pandemic to be self-sufficient, to look at our budgets, and you can appreciate we've got a huge machine, but in any given moment, sort of retracting and expanding where we needed to during the pandemic and not being reliant on promised one-time funding from upper levels of government. Certainly that is that help is needed, and you're hearing that across municipalities, but we made the conscious decision to retract our programs, minimize what we could accomplish, and it's put us honestly in great stead going into this cycle. We're proposing to you a budget that's on track and on forecast, 3%. But again, we're looking at double digits. If we didn't make those decisions previously, if council didn't, and if there's not support for continued investment in the reserves to weather the storm ultimately, we'd be in big trouble. You would be looking at, honestly, double-digit tax increases this year. So I really do believe that we've come in with a responsible budget collectively. And again, I hope you appreciate sort of that continued effort. And I think we need to continue on with that theme as well. And I mentioned about public engagement. And I think it's important. We saw, council meeting attendance, information. We created a jump-in platform. Online petitions was suggested by the previous term of council. Those engagement pieces were fantastic, and they really drew in a whole new audience. They also drew in not just a local audience, but I mentioned we've got 25,000 plus seasonal residents. They were able to access information and have a voice in many of the initiatives in the last term of council. So we want to capitalize on those and continue on with that as well. So we'll go to the next slide. which is really the 2023 sort of objectives. A couple things. It's a new council, but we don't want to take for granted that there are some that have been on multiple terms of council or other terms of council. But as you know, legislation changes, things change. So we want to have a fresh start with the new group. You're going to maybe be, I don't know if you'll be tired of my voice by then, but you'll be tired of our collective voice by the end of the year, because we really want to do a proactive orientation program for you. We don't want to cram it all into the first 2 or 3 months, but I think beyond your sort of normal business in the first year, after we get through budgets, there are some planned orientation sessions that we'll do almost on a monthly basis, right to the end of Q2, and then we'll continue on. We'll be getting into our 2024 budget program in July. I hate to tell you that in advance, so maybe we should have done 2 years today. So a lot of training and development, and again, I want to use this opportunity to. Any question's a good question too, so please ask, reach out, whether it's to me, to departments, to staff. We want to make sure that you have the best information, and any advice or recommendations that you have or information you need, please let us know. In the immediate term, other than budget, you've been tasked with onboarding and being members and leaders on your committees, boards, and task forces, and there's a number of them. And they're very important as well. They are sort of voices of those respective programs of the community, providing good recommendations through to you to make decisions, whether it's with budget or investing in certain sort of programs or issues. And so that has been ongoing. I know you're being onboarded almost weekly throughout January, and we will start orienting those boards and groups as well through you in the coming months. Our strategic planning is another that the last term of council, we kicked off in 2018, just prior leading into it, a strategic planning exercise, and published our first sort of community strategic plan. It has a 4-year life cycle, and we're in the last year of that previous item, and that's deliberate to sort of have an overlap with terms of council. So this year, on top of boards and committee duties, budgets, and some of the task force work that you'll be doing, we also want to engage you in building a new strategic plan that will cover the years 2024 to 27. So stay tuned for that. We'll be doing a number of sessions with you and consultations outward. Overall, there's just been many lessons that were learned through our collective pandemic experience. Service expectations have changed. There's no question. When people are coming back, different expectations, even different interactions in terms of how we're connecting with the public. And so again, while we're continued on sort of our day-to-day operations, we need to learn from those lessons, capitalize on them, and move them forward and implement them. So we're going to look at how we deliver customer service again and continuously. And we're going to look at best practices. We want to make sure that our service levels are the same or better than pre-pandemic at the end of the day. And lastly, I'll just mention that this continued investment in infrastructure to accelerate recovery, to me, is critical. So we have made some shifts and adjustments in previous year budgets and this year. Again, we want to round out and focus on investment in downtowns. I think it's critical. We're seeing such a multiplier and impact back on refreshing and updating the infrastructure and supporting some of the business renovations and updates as well. And businesses are coming along as well and recovering, I would suggest, at a faster rate, at least some. But it's not to say that some aren't hurting. And so other investments in our roads to stay at and get ahead of that, and other amenities. That was the other area that pandemic, the public leaned on a number of our amenities, whether it was just simply trails, parks, washrooms, some of the facilities that we offer. And so we want to make sure that our budgets are supporting those and supporting those amenities continuously moving on. So lastly, Mr. Mayor, on the Mayor and Council, I want to talk about the budget pressures briefly. And again, this isn't pressures on your specific budget, but probably more global or broad-based. If you want to just flip the next slide. And I've mentioned it, and I don't need to go into it at length, but inflation and affordability, it's a balancing act. We have to run and manage a business. We need to invest in our business and keep moving it forward. We also have to be very responsible, ensure that we're doing it in a sustainable and affordable manner. But we need to balance sort of these deficits, these infrastructure sort of deficits that we're trying to tackle and get ahead of, for example, but do it in a way that respects sort of where we're at and affordability locally. The other is our aging infrastructure. You'll see this on a slide from 10 years ago, and you'll continue to. We want to do continued investment in repairs, life cycle extension, replacement where it makes sense. We also need to retract or reduce our overall city footprint. As you can appreciate, post-amalgamation, 16 local and 1 county layer. They all had buildings, they had facilities. Some of them need to be rationalized, consolidated, so that not only do we maintain service, but we deliver a better service through them overall, rather than trying to be everything to everybody. So that is an ongoing sort of issue with our municipality, certainly. Just to give you some context, and to me it's an astounding number. I mean, I mentioned we're quite big in size, probably a mid-sized municipality overall in the province. But in today's dollars, you're managing capital assets that are valued over $4 billion. And this is, we talk about buildings, we talk about roads, we talk about water plants, we talk about all of these sort of different assets. And when you've got assets that exceed $4 billion in value, you can imagine the context to try to keep up with them, to make sure that the lights are still turning on, that the roofs are still in good shape, that the roads are at a decent quality, and they all have different life cycles and so on. But I think we've been making some great efforts, and I'm hoping this budget represents another leap forward in how we continue to maintain those capital assets with the investment that is proposed. So in conclusion, Mr. Mayor, your general operating budget is part of the operating budget book. We've got significant new councillors, and so we want to make sure that in the first year and ongoing that you have the necessary resources, the training and development opportunities that you need, and those advocacy opportunities that I mentioned before. So there are significant, whether it's conferences, meetings with upper levels of government, those are important to advance our local needs. And so the budget that's proposed for 2023 generally reflects and accommodates that. We'll monitor it over this year, though, recognizing that there was a large turnover on the council. And so if we need to do any modest increase the following year to ensure that you have all of the opportunities that you need, we'll do so and propose that in the next cycle. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to pause. I'll try to answer any questions that you might have, or you feel free yourself.
Thank you. Just a couple of notes. I think some of you, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by this process. We go through our budget in this particular fashion. Many municipalities, and usually larger municipalities, don't go to this effort. What they do is they get a report from staff and they debate it for one day, and they either pass the budget or they don't pass the budget. You see it in places like the City of Toronto, where that takes place. They don't go line by line. They don't go through a number of individual budgets. I think our process is better. I think it's more responsive to our residents, and I think it means that we're more connected with the projects that are going on and with how things are being done in our community. So I quite like the process we have, and I think it serves us well. The other thing I wanted to say was I think it's a great thing that we are on plan for our financial plan. And of course, you will have an opportunity to look at that and make changes or not as you so choose. But I will say, in discussions with other municipalities, I just came back from the Eastern Ontario Wardens Caucus, and there was no one there who had tax increases as low as we did. Many of them were 6, 7, 8, 9%. If you notice, the City of Toronto, it's for the first time in many, many years, is facing a tax increase of almost 7%. And they're still going to have a budget shortfall of over $1 billion. So I think that we have been fiscally responsible in the past. We have reserves, and we're putting forward a good plan that will serve us well going through this year. And we'll see where we are as we move into the budget cycle for next year. But I think that good decisions have been made in the past, and that I expect that we will make good decisions going forward, and things will continue to move along in conjunction with our long-term financial plan. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments on that. And with that, Councillor Warren, you have a question?
I do, through you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for the presentation, Ron. Just going through like the start of the budget, the overall budget, the first couple pages, and looking at like wages are, if not the most, the biggest part of the budget. I was looking at, well, coming out of the pandemic, it looked like we weren't spending as much going forward in staffing. And I was wondering, shouldn't actually wages, or the number of people, wages increase this year as we hire new people and we get back to a somewhat normal year? And I guess gapping also was an issue too, with people, you know, leaving the corporation and people sick and just moving on. So I guess that's a kind of a large question about staffing.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll just give some sweeping comments at this point, but I will mark down so that when we go through budget deliberations and operating, we can drill down into the very deep details of staffing. But to answer your general question, Councillor Warren, and great question in terms of a focus. So there was a point in time during the pandemic, probably the last 2-year cycles, where I mentioned we made adjustments based on service constraints, service response, and staffing levels to kind of pull levers of going to minimal service. There were some times where we had to cancel some programs even during parts, and as you can appreciate, that translates into less staffing. But it was really a product of tough recruitment during that time period. Some of the reasons that you had mentioned as well, many were in certain industries moving and shifting to different positions sort of throughout. But the main reason was more the constraints on service. So I'll give you an example, was in the one summer, 2021, we didn't run any summer camp programs. And so we do have 50 plus students that we onboard. So that's one example. There were constraints even with certain facilities. Arenas were closed. Buildings were closed. So where we would have staff supporting some of those functions, we sort of made the decision more to not onboard new and try to sort of manage it. Because as you can appreciate now, we would be in bad stead if we couldn't tap into that labor force today to now restart and reset things. So it was quite a fine line. So in the budget, you'll see though that the numbers weren't maybe as crazy as they probably were practically, because when we budget in any given year, it's based on the position, not the individuals. And then we sort of reconcile it at year end. So what I can say is the previous year's surpluses that council had were beyond what our normal surpluses are. Part of the contribution was gapping or savings in wages that then would be translated into a subsequent year. I would say that trend trickled through 2022, maybe less so as we started to open things up, but it is still a trend. And as you mentioned or requested, later in February, we'll try to quantify that a little bit for you as well. So it's quite a balancing act.
It just seemed low.
Well, and again, you're looking at an actual probably versus a proposed. And so the difference in the proposed last year or previous and actual would show that gapping that you attribute it to.
Councillor Joyce?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you. And that's just want to thank you, Councillor Warren, on that. I fully respect we went through this 2020 and 2021. I run my own budgets too, and the difficulty to, I respect the difficulty to come up with this 2023 budget, because it's running out of this, from this pandemic it just throws all your predictions, normal predictions, out the window. But that also emphasizes why 2019 will help me understand 2023 numbers when it can reflect to 2019 when operations were normal versus things were all over the map in 2020 and 2021. I just wanted to emphasize why 2019 I think is important to us. Numbers. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, Mr. Mayor, if there aren't any other questions on sort of the mayor and council, I'm going to now shift over to the chief administrative office, or my department, essentially. And I just want to make sure we should have some managers or leaders joining us on Zoom. Some will be in person. This isn't just unique to my department, but all day. And so I just want to make sure that they're queued up. But I'm going to start then with just introducing, so the first of 9 departments, small but very mighty department, very administrative in focus, myself, and then essentially there are 3 sort of divisions, offices, or program areas. One is the Office of the City Clerk, and that's led by Kathy Ritchie, our City Clerk. Legal Services, which is led by our City Solicitor, Robin Carlson, and our Strategy Management Office, which is led by Brenda Stonehouse. So again, I apologize, I can't see everybody, so if they're joining us, what we were hoping is that I'll provide just a general overview of our department, but certainly they're the experts in their respective area. And so if you have any questions, I know they'll be more than happy to supplement or provide the right information for sure. So I mentioned sort of 3 general divisions. As you can appreciate, a lot of different programs and functions within each. So Office of the City Clerk has the normal clerk's office function, supporting council, supporting committees, and all of the associated sort of agendas and administration that goes along with that. There is also a records and archives program and area that falls under the clerk, as well as our municipal law enforcement and licensing group. In legal services, we have beyond sort of the normal sort of actual legal services that the solicitor provides or liaises and coordinates with external legal. Also have provincial offenses, so POA, realty services, so all of our land and real estate functions, as well as our insurance and risk management program. And then thirdly, under our strategy management group, I don't know if group is right. We've got one strong and mighty at this time. Brenda does a great job of leading strategic planning on your behalf, and she will be leading you and us through that next iteration or process, but also doing it departmentally, doing it for other external partners as well, and connecting them with our programs and services. Focusing on what we term or call our Make It Better program, which is that continuous improvement, lean program, where we're constantly looking at process improvements and continuous improvements corporately. And then thirdly is special corporate projects. So I would share some of these with Brenda as well. These are more broad-based, where they're not in any given department. Might be advocacy, it might be broader modernization reviews, for example, that were done in the last term of council through provincial funding. And the main one, sort of active and immediate, is our Empower program, which is our pandemic recovery program, looking internally and how we improve and capitalize on some of the lessons learned in our operations over the last several years. So we will go to the next slide. So to give you an overview, so my and department's main responsibility is the overall efficient management of the municipal administration broadly and the corporation. We want to provide advice, good advice to you, so guidance to council. I provide and group provides leadership to our senior staff and to our departments generally, and really sort of serves as that liaison, if you will, between the administration and council yourselves. I mentioned the divisions that make up the department, but essentially, like the next department will overview, I also see ourselves as a corporate services, corporate support department, more broadly, so supporting all of the departments, whether that's financially, whether that's through sort of guidance, leadership, and then sort of liaison through you. And I mentioned that one of the other responsibilities of you, but it also would feed through my role, would be being a spokesperson for the city, acting as a liaison with the province, making sure that our external municipal advocacy is heard. So whether that's through organizations or associations, the mayor mentioned the Warden's Caucus, for example, but we're active with the AMO, which is the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and other sort of industry organizations in the municipal space. We want to contribute to that and make sure where our priorities are, we need to align with them. And better strength in numbers, right? So we want to make sure that we're going forward where our voices will be heard. And I mentioned, I think one of the most important is maintaining those institutional partners or those large community partners locally, and making sure that we're supporting one another. And again, whether it's Fleming College, our Ontario Health team that's emerging locally, the hospital. Again, these are just a few examples of some major institutions that we want to maintain partnership with. So we'll go to the next slide, talk a little bit about some of the highlights from the previous term and in 2022. And as I mentioned, really top of mind, highest priority from my perspective, and really through to all departments, was pandemic response, recovery, and reset. Somebody likened previously to the organization, it's a big ship, but to turn a ship, I know you appreciate, takes quite a bit of time and resources. Having said that, you didn't have the luxury of, in some cases, going at that pace. We had to collectively make quick decisions, look at how services were going to be delivered, protect our staff, protect you, protect the public in our interactions. And I honestly thought it was extremely well done, and I don't take personal credit for it by any means. It was our 1,200 people strong and the support of the last term and this term of council, quite frankly, in accomplishing it. And again, we just want to maintain and enhance our programs and services. So that theme of resetting, what did we learn? How do we move forward and look at new service delivery models is something that is a priority and top of mind in the department. So a couple of other highlights, I'll do them more by division and area. So in our strategy management group, I mentioned we launched an Empower program. We drew resources in from other departments, and it was essentially a methodical approach to look at how we do service delivery, what was top of mind, how do we reset some of our services, and actually we focused in very quickly on some big issues. So technology, how we're leveraging it and managing it. We looked at community hubs. You've heard this concept where we're starting to consolidate service entry points and providing more service and more broadly throughout the city. And the last sort of focus was, but not least, alternate work, hybrid work, how we do our work as an administration, whether that was work from home, out in the field, and all different combinations thereof. And so we're right in the middle of various phases to that program. And I mentioned that we're always focused on continuous improvement and process improvement, and it was no exception sort of through that office. We continued to train our staff that were coming in on lean, on the philosophy. We have extended that to more specialized training. So it's not just sort of front level, high level, if you will, understanding of the philosophy, but it's now giving our staff and our people the tools to really analyze our processes and to continuously improve in their thinking and how they do things. And so even in 2022, we had 7 graduates in the Yellow Belt program. White Belt is sort of the entry, if you will, into it. We have 163 staff that are now trained and certified in some level of lean. So it's fantastic. That is a huge number. And we're really seeing dividends, again, through even simple process improvements to very large scale. In our records and archives, again, a very small and mighty group, but we have a record center locally in Lindsay, and they have just exploded in terms of looking at how we manage our records, how we manage our assets and archives, and just doing a ton of work, whether it's related to electronic records management, again, looking at how we track and catalog those assets, and just bringing more on and formalizing how we maintain and keep our archives and records, and it's important. And there was over 5,250 different archive descriptions that were just completed last year, just to kind of give you an idea. So 5,000 plus different pieces of archives that we wanted to put some definition around. Municipal law and licensing group. There's one group that certainly had to pivot hard during the pandemic. We were getting legislation and direction from the province, from the local health unit as well. And so in 2022, and certainly in the previous years, just enforcing those local rules and shifting and adjusting. Some were changes weekly. And they were able to sort of prioritize, maintain sort of resources to be able to do that. And again, at the same time, still able to manage their core services of bylaw enforcement, licensing of various functions where it was needed and relied on by residents or businesses. And you would have seen recently at council, again, operations don't end. And so we were entering into a new pound contract for dogs and working with the Humane Society to offer that continued service and partnership ongoing. And in our legal services, I mentioned there's a lot of legal work that's always done and ongoing. But beyond that, that small and mighty group in the realty services area sold over $500,000 in real property and land. And these are not typically your easy sales. They're not obvious buildable parcels of land. They're remnant pieces. Quite frankly, they're very difficult to either maintain on our inventory or to dispose of. But Realty Services was able to meet and exceed sort of their annual target for sales. Those sales go into our reserves to reinvest back into properties, whether it's general property or if it was parkland type, we're required to put those proceeds back into the parkland reserve to reinvest in new parks and park maintenance. And our Provincial Offences Administration, or known as POA, again, another area that had many closures and constraints put on them. And as you can appreciate, they're managing a provincial program as well. In the pandemic, there were times where trial times, or to get to trial for local issues, more localized issues, were exceeding 18 months on average. And very quickly over 2022, our POA group has been able to reduce that dramatically. We're now looking at about 11-month average trial times. But as you can appreciate, that's also with public coming back and the courts ramping up their operations as well. On the next slide, talk about highlights for 2023, some of the things that we're looking at. Again, I really want to have an active and ongoing orientation program with you. And so again, don't be shy. I need to hear what you need, what information you require, immediate and ongoing, to make good decisions, or just for general information. And we probably won't end either in 2023. We'll be doing ongoing tours of the city, talking about certain topics and programs as well in future years and throughout the term. I talked about the Empower program, that pandemic recovery focus, and I did mention already sort of those focus areas or priority areas that we're looking at. And I probably didn't do it justice in my immediate. We're going to provide you with an update on that program in detail at a coming council meeting as well. I mentioned that one of your responsibilities is to approve policies, council policies. You have about 50 or 60 of them, plus or minus. That is a substantive decrease in not the previous term, but one prior. You had about 200. And there was a rationalization exercise that was done to look at all of the council-approved policies, consolidate some of them, discontinue some of them that, quite frankly, were outdated, look at converting some of them were policies that were sort of internal corporate. So we've created new management directives, we call them, that are more corporate policies in nature. But we will be, and it is required for each term of council to review your policies, to refresh and update them. And so we will run or coordinate a program for you to do that. We'll look at the 50, we'll pare down the ones that are still relevant, ones that need some work, and then depending on the nature and scale of it, it'll be your decision how you approach and tackle some of those policies. So that one's a stay tuned. We'll only focus on the immediate ones for this particular calendar year. So you're going to have some through orientation. We'll talk about, so for example, the procurement policy we're planning on bringing early in the term. And then methodically over next year and subsequent year, we'll go through all 50 plus policies. And then the last strategic plan, as I mentioned, we're going to have a number of sessions in the latter part of this year. We want to concurrently conclude or deliver on some of the priorities that were set in the current plan and or capitalize and carry over into the new plan based on your direction and recommendations in the new plan. So we'll continue on the next slide with other highlights, short-term rentals. You heard that on your campaign trail. It was a top-of-mind issue last year. There is a review that has been ongoing, and recommendations are coming in this quarter of 2023 from Municipal Law and Licensing. Mentioned these land sales. We'll continue to do that. Looking at reviewing our lands, looking at rationalizing them, whether it's, again, consolidating them, selling them, repurposing them. And this is right across the board. Obviously, Realty Services focuses more on the real property or land, but through partnerships and through other departments like Community Services, we'll be looking at our overall building and spaces portfolios as well ongoing, and doing things like I mentioned, community hubs, consolidating some functions, continuing to look at how we maximize certain facilities and spaces, recommend closure of certain spaces or buildings that, or structures even, that quite frankly are past their life cycle, don't maybe have a core function anymore, and so we can look at options potentially of selling or repurposing those spaces as well. And then I mentioned that ongoing, we'll be focused on a archival program that's much more focused and detailed, and looking at all of our archival assets. Lastly, Mr. Mayor, I'm just going to talk briefly about budget pressures. And now as I give this update on pressures, it's more with departmental focused on the department budget. Essentially, the CAO's department budget is status quo. It's very much in line with last year's budget request and actuals. There are a couple of areas where there is going to be some modest increases, whether it's on some contracted services, like our integrity commissioner. That budget sort of runs through the clerk's office, contracted services and training. So looking at, I mentioned the short-term rentals program. We want to make sure that we have some budget and resources put to that to be able to follow up, enforce, etc. There is some modest reduction in revenues forecasted as well, but as I know you appreciate, we're starting to recover, but it's hard to sort of predict year-end 2023 now how exactly those revenues that we experienced pre-pandemic are going to actually land. So we've taken very conservative estimates in this year's budget and previous to make do for that. A little bit of increase in insurance. There is some modest increases in claims. So overall, again, sort of a balancing of the budget, but again, a very modest 2023 increase proposed. I think with that, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to pause and certainly happy to answer any questions you might have, or certainly our team that I introduced as well.
Thank you. Questions or comments? Councillor Ashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the CAO and to Brenda up there. Wanted to point out the Office of Strategy Management. We brought this in, I believe, in the early part of the last council, and just wondering if Brenda could just briefly explain what we've done here. I know we've done tremendous return on the dollar for this program. I think there's been over $6 million of quantifiable savings, and that was before the pandemic even happened. So this program here is a really good program, and just wondering if Brenda could update just briefly what we're doing right now, and will you be getting another staff member? There used to be two of you there, there's just one, but this certainly pays dividends, this program, and maybe just sort of let the new councillors know, and all councillors and everybody here, what the update is right now in that program, please. Thanks.
Ms. Stonehouse.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. The Office of Strategy Management deals with continuous improvement in our organization through our Make It Better program. So we have trained white belts, yellow belts. We also have green belts and black belts that look at improving our processes. And for the past few years, we have been doing that, obviously through a pandemic lens, but really taking a look at all of the processes within our departments to document them, take a look at, where is the waste, which is what we look for in lean, things like bottlenecks or handoffs, those things. So we are not tracking financial savings, so hard dollar savings for these improvements. What we are doing is looking at the productivity improvements and the improvements to the streamlining of the processes themselves. So this is happening within every department. A lot of them are being tracked through a centralized system that we have on SharePoint. And we're going to continue with that work. We are looking at training some more people this year, all of our new employees, and looking to get all of our employees trained at least in white belt, which is that introduction to lean. And we will be looking at another cohort of our yellow belt, which requires staff to attend some sessions to learn about lean and then do a project. And then that project is defended and then they are certified for that. But Office of Strategy Management is also focused on the strategic planning side of things for the corporation. So with council this year, we'll be looking at the strategic plan, also helping departments work through their strategy for their work, specifically in their business unit. And our Empower program, which is sort of make it better plus innovation is what we're looking at with Empower, looking at all of those lessons learned through the pandemic and figuring out the best ways to move forward with a focus on our customer, whether that is internal to each other or external customers.
Thank you.
Hopefully that helps.
Okay, thanks. Just a quick question on scorecards. Is that across every department when you refer to scorecards? Could you just briefly explain that? Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. We are working on scorecards to be in alignment with the strategic plan. And so the pandemic kind of shifted that focus a little bit. So not every department has a scorecard at this point. When we develop the 2024 strategic plan with you as council, out of that will come a cascading scorecard system. So there will be an overall corporate scorecard, departmental scorecards that align with that, divisional scorecards, and then right down to individual employee goals that will all be in alignment with the strategic plan. We had planned on doing that, very robust scorecards with this past strategic plan, but unfortunately the pandemic derailed that effort. But it is in the plan for the next strategic plan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. If there's nothing else, Councillor Joyce.
Sorry, I was late pushing that button. Thank you very much. I'm just personally 100% behind training. I think the Lean program is fantastic. You're saying you don't measure do you measure any metrics at all? And sometimes it's the intangibles. For example, internal surveys is company or employee morale lifted after going through the program, as an example. Do you measure things like that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. Yes, we're looking at performance measures throughout the organization at various different levels. And so what we want to look at is a balanced scorecard that looks at obviously financial measures, which is what you're looking at through the budget and how we do with that. But then we also have a customer focus. So measurements that are looking at how our services land on the customer, be that external or internal. We have internal processes that we are measuring, and there are a number of different ways we are measuring those depending on the actual process. So things like cycle time or just, how many we can get done in a certain amount of time. And then there is the growth and development. So that is for our staff to make sure that they have the tools and resources that they need to provide the services to our residents. So measurement will be a big focus again with the next strategic plan. There are a lot of measures in place now in each department looking at their key performance indicators.
Thank you. That sounds fantastic. Thank you for that.
Okay. Why don't we take till 10:45? Are you fine with that? Let's call it back to order. Get started again. We have some housekeeping to do here. Could we, I need a mover and seconder to receive item 6.1, the Mayor and Council Office Budget Overview. Councillor Warren, Councillor Yeo, all in favor? And that's passed. We're twice blessed this morning. We have our CAO who is going to stand in for Director Hawley, who has come down with...
I think that's corporate service.
Oh, that's not... Well, there I go.
Triple.
Sorry. You're going to do the corporate services one first. We're 3 times blessed. Go ahead. Corporate services, sorry. I thought with Carolyn here, she'd do it, but, you know.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, I too feel blessed this morning. I truly do. I am going to lean on Carolyn and others in this presentation and the next one, but want to walk you through the Corporate Services Department, the second update of our 9 departments. And we'll start with just the general structure of that department. So corporate services, as the title suggests, is predominantly there to support other operating departments and other functions corporately. I am quite pleased to let you know that formally we are onboarding a new corporate services director, Sarah Bukaboom. She is starting on January 30th. And I don't know if that was deliberate or not to get through these first round of things, but we'll certainly initiate her properly. But this department, again, like others, there's a number of focus areas within this department. So there's communications, advertising, and marketing. And that group is led by Sherry Davidson. And I hope that others are joining me, as I mentioned in the previous. People Services, new title and restructure of our former Human Resources HR division is People Services. We'll talk a bit more about that restructure, and it is led by Leanna Patterson, who actually is in person with us today. Our Information Technology, IT, currently is led Acting Manager Chris Moncrief. And you may recall, some of you at least, Carrie Clevin is the manager. She's been seconded for a couple more months to work on our Empower program and the technology changes and shifts specifically. So she will be returning to that manager's role. We have Linda Liotti, who leads our Rev and Tax division and area. And last but not least, we have Carolyn Daines, who is our treasurer and leads the treasury and finance. So we'll go to the next slide. And again, I'll offer them up that at the end of my sort of overview and remarks, certainly they're all here and available to answer any questions that you have. And if we can't answer them today, then we'll give them to Sarah when she comes and she'll follow up with you. But essentially, as I mentioned, corporate services, really the focus is to lead, monitor, and manage corporate functions, support those sort of back office functions that they're not typically in the limelight, but they're critical. And you could tell just by some of the different divisions where those focus would be. But essentially looking at financial and human resource management, or our people, effective corporate communications, whether that's externally or internally, strategic information technology. So IT technology continues to go through a revolution, and we need to have the right people and understand our business operations and functions to be able to maximize and leverage the technology that we're investing in. And so we'll go to the next slide, just talk a little bit about some of the previous year and term highlights. One of the main ones, and I had mentioned to you, multi-departmental really, but completing that long-range financial plan was a core priority in the last term, and it was updated for a 10-year period starting this year. We are at the end of the budget process. One of the things that we'll be doing as sort of a new process with council is we'll then reconcile in the next quarter that long-range financial plan. So you're working on budgets now. We'll know better what our 2022 position is in, I'll say, the second quarter of this year. And we'll also know what you approved as a 2023 budget. So we want to take that information, drop it into the long-term 10-year plan, and then make any adjustments and shifts accordingly. So again, while we're always looking in year short term, we need to keep our eye on the longer term and some of those themes. So stay tuned for that. We'll schedule that in Q2 of this year. One of the things I mentioned, not just our product maybe, for the restructure in people's services, was developing a people strategy. So really taking a step back. This really was initiated from issues pre-pandemic, but also during, and establishing a strategy. I almost call it a commitment, a corporate commitment document to our staff, to our people. And that was developed, led by Leanna, and we're now implementing those priorities and pieces to it. But it helped inform how we restructured so we had the right focus. It focused on sort of 5 priority areas, being attraction and retention of people, people development, leader excellence and support, and culture management. And so that's just one that you're going to hear more about in the coming months, was developed by our people as well. So there was extensive sort of consultation externally and feedback from many of our staff. So I talked about the restructure. We also launched the document imaging software. This is for AP, accounts payable. And essentially it's centralizing the AP function, including receipt of invoices by the AP department. It allows for electronic approvals, electronic invoices, and they're all online. And so this really essentially is a process improvement, and it allows Treasury to better predict year-end positions or track in more real-time expenditures, et cetera, in AP. And the other, a couple of other updates, we've done some extensive work in our communications area out externally, rebranding the city, and then trying to expose that brand and doing it through a number of social media channels, through our own site, et cetera. And so we had an extensive increased exposure to our target audiences, 30% growth in our website traffic, for example. And that's been ongoing sort of year over year increases. Astounding number, we had media exposure of over 200 million viewers. I mean, it's a massive number, but essentially it's getting us out of the local, into the regional, into the national, and even international sort of exposure where it makes sense and where we can try to tap in. And I probably should have mentioned early on in the budget when we talked about our city and some of the demographics and just some of the stats. The other one is the visitations, the visitors, and you'll hear it a bit more obviously in the Economic Development Group, but we get over 1.5 million visitors to the city as well. And although they're not direct residents, ratepayers, they certainly support our local businesses, and just locally, we need to reach out to those audiences as well. So it's a big number, and it's starting to expand beyond just a summer sort of destination, sort of throughout. It is becoming year-round, but just another one that we're providing some programs and services for. And then lastly, on the IT side, there was minor restructure. One of the questions was asked. We've shifted and moved the majority of our GIS functionality into IT. We still have some specialized services that remain in development services. And generally, though, we created or updated our IT strategic plan or strategy. We had a previous document, And sort of post-pandemic, we wanted to update and refresh that plan. And it's a multi-year plan moving forward. Focuses on our investment in technology, how we resource our people, and then gets into some specifics in terms of, for example, the previous term of council had asked us to look at a vision for cloud services, so where we store, how we store, and do our data. So that's just a couple of general highlights. Let's go to the next and talk about 23. So some of the highlights or objectives that we're looking at in year. One is mainly to establish, but I'll say more so to expand on our IDEA program. So inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. Traditionally, you would have known probably that through our clerk's area, we had managed an accessibility program, had a coordinator, and we slightly realigned or restructured sort of that function. So accessibility concerns, both external and internal, and then an expanded portfolio beyond to look at inclusion, to look at diversity. So, for example, things like our Truth and Reconciliation program that was launched in the previous term in People Services, that group will be monitoring and managing that functionality. Water meter replacement project is ongoing. That was a multi-year replacement program that we've done methodically through various urban centers, and it will be ongoing. I'm not sure exactly when it meets its conclusion, but it was a multi-year, I think 3 to 5 year program. But we can expand on that if you're interested. And then to support alternate work arrangements. So again, a technology revolution I had mentioned, quite frankly, and just demand, high demand, whether it's from the public in terms of how they interact with you, how they interact with the city. We're going or electronic in all functions as an option. It's not to say that it's going to replace some of our in-person interactions and connections, but we have to balance it with where the demand is. And we just saw astounding increases in demand for online service. I gave you a couple examples previously. So we want to make sure that we're keeping up with what we invest in hardware and software to be able to facilitate that. And our annual retirement obligations, so an ARO study that's going to take place over this year. It's essentially to determine our assets that have obligations around retiring those assets. Like a landfill, for example, it reaches its life's end, needs to be retired, and there's obviously post-retirement, if you will, obligations that we have as a city to manage and maintain that space. And so we'll be doing a look at that, ensure that we're meeting all of our obligations as required under the Public Sector Accounting Board legislation. I did mention you will be reviewing certain policies. There's a couple that corporate services will be bringing forward earlier than later in your term. One is the purchasing policy. We want to do that early on so that you understand how we procure and purchase goods and services, and any improvements that are needed to that policy. Same with our capital close policy. And again, I mentioned some of the time constraints that we're experiencing. We want to make sure that the policy is responsive to you, provides the best information, but we want to set achievable expectations and standards on capital projects when they're opened, when they're closed, and how they're funded. So that's just two, for example. The IT group continues to look at disaster recovery, both improvements and enhancements. Whether that's to sort of our secondary systems, our backups. We did experience an outage in the last term of council from weather damage or from a water leak on some main servers. And it did put us down for a period of time, for about a week. And so we want to make sure we learn from that and invest properly so that we have redundancies built in place. And IT has done a great job of being all over that and making sure that we have that ability to switch over. And then lastly, we want to refresh our communication strategy. That's another area that social media and communications and the importance of it is ever changing. So we want to make sure that we have the right priorities set and a strategy in place, both internal and external. And so lastly, Mr. Mayor, I just want to focus on a couple of budget pressures that maybe we're looking at or forecasting. And again, you'll see that, and we'll highlight those later when we go through this department's operating budget. But essentially, WSIB claims, they are increasing due to a few factors. It includes mental health claims, especially in our first response, emergency services. Claims themselves are becoming much more complex. In terms of how recovery takes place, what are the support services for those particular claims as well. And then there are just cumulative active cases, so presumptive legislation. There's all of these sort of different things that are just putting pressures on some of those costs. So we want to make sure that we're ahead of that. There is some forecasted costs for indemnity insurance. Again, we can talk a little bit more about that in our future updates when we go through the operating budget. We do want to refocus or expand on our corporate training. And as Councillor Joyce mentioned, it's different training again. We're going back in person. Even some of the training opportunities are now being reactivated that weren't available a couple of years ago. So with a new council, a lot of new staff onboarding, which I think is very positive, we want to make sure that we equip them and you with the right corporate training and information. And like every other business, there is inflationary costs and pressures. It's no different on whether it's our annual software costs or even our IT hardware. So these are sort of cost pressures that we need to maintain those assets for a whole bunch of good reasons. We need to make sure that we're budgeting properly to at least maintain them in good stead. And that, I think, concludes corporate services overview. But again, happy to answer any questions, or certainly the strong and mighty leaders in those respective areas can do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Smeaton.
Thanks, through you, Mr. Mayor. Just really quickly, we've talked in a lot of divisions now about training and the need for training, of course, and all these different things, which is great. And Councillor Joyce brought that up earlier. And I was curious, would that be material supplies and services? Or is that considered a service when we're looking at each? It's come across each division. So would that be where we would find that in a budget? Is that's a service provided within a division? I don't see training specifically. And if so, wherever it is, I'm just wondering, when we come across budgets, will each presentation break that down so we know that actually a certain percentage of the services is for training? Like, I'm just wondering where I'll be able to know financially which is training within each division.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, I am going to defer the training question to Carolyn. I did want to just answer maybe your second question, which was when we raise, or you'll have an opportunity to go deeper or line by line. So when we go through the capital budget, we will go program by program, essentially page by page. And there will be department reps that are capital heavy, I'll say, that'll supplement information. The operating budget happens later in February, and similarly, we'll go through each area. The treasurer had already talked a little bit about, there's a glossary and sort of here's the areas and definitions. But it's a great question, and you'll have that opportunity to drill down into program areas, and we'll try to expose, if it's a training question, for example, pose it and ask it through the process, and then we'll make sure to stop and when we go through the operating budget itself. In terms of the corporate services training, for example, maybe I'll ask Carolyn if she can answer your question with respect to where training falls in the sort of program line listings.
Thank you. Through you to the councillor. Actually, training falls under materials, and you will see that each department has like a summary page, and it's a little bit more broken down, so you'll see it under materials, supplies, and services in each one. And if you look at even just the corporate summary, it's under, the corporate training is under materials, supplies, and services on page 15. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Ashmore.
Through you to the CAO. Just a question on information technology. It's almost scary how dependent we are and so reliable we are on IT to help us out, whether you're running a government like we are, or a business, or your personal matters. What they did a year and a half ago when we had this issue in September 21, they really rallied and they've saved a lot of data and protected what we had. But I'm sure they don't want to go through it again. Neither does anybody want to go through that experience again in disaster recovery. But we need funds put in there, and we need to be really diligent about that. My question is, it looks like we're increasing our budget, but our budget to contracting out to close to 400,000. Do you know roughly what that 400,000 is going to be put towards?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I don't know precisely, so I would hate to mislead. I mean, I do know that just generally, we have a number of contracted services for our systems, certain updates, and like everything else, costs are increasing. I don't know if, just double check, maybe Chris, if you wouldn't mind, could maybe highlight sort of where the immediate pressure is in 23 as he sees it.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. Probably on this one, I'll have to go back to the team just because I'm acting for just a couple months here. So, but a lot of the pressure is staffing resources from our end. We've had to contract out services because we just don't have the number of staff to handle all the projects and all the new things we're doing in IT. So, yeah, I'd have to get right down with the budget staff to see where that's coming from. But most of it is just contracting out services that we just don't have the staff.
I think Ms. Daines is suggesting she may have an answer.
Through you to the councillor. I tend to know every line in the budget, so I apologize. I'm a bit of a geek. This is due to their morphing into SharePoint Online this year, because SharePoint, the way we have it set up, is end of life, and that's really the major increase in the contracted service line in that budget.
Thank you. Councillor Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, this is more of a general question on staff salary and wages. In this particular case, there's no staff added, but it's increased 14% in 1 year. But I also noticed in other departments, no staff added, the increase is 2 or 3%. So it's kind of all over the map. So it's a general question if you can address that.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So I will address it generally, and then I'll follow up, though, when we get into operating. But this is one area where it's not just a product of, I'll say, restructure. So we had a couple of new positions that were previously sort of onboarded in our people services. So there's some of the costs would be reflective of that. The other is some realignments. And there was a question, I believe Councillor Ashmore asked previously about our OSM group, for example. So there's been a couple of positions corporately that we've realigned into people services. And so I think you'll see that translation into the budget overall. There was also 1 or 2 new positions that we never pursued or filled in other areas. One was an internal auditor, for example. But we are going to now launch that post-pandemic and realign it sort of with a lot of the work and auditing work that we're doing internally. So that's just kind of a bit of commentary. I hope it's helpful to kind of say that it's not just sort of new staff or current. It's a product of some shifts in the organization, and because they're under that new budget, you'll see an increase in the wages there. There should be a net decrease in another department elsewhere, but we're happy to point those out sort of when we get deep into the operating budget.
Councillor Warren.
Through you, this was just the overall question. Maybe I should have asked it earlier, but it's been a burning question for me going through this that will have to do with capital. The federal gas tax, is it increased this year or not? Because it's looked like 9,000 and then there was an extra chunk. So I just wanted to know if that was 9,000 plus. I should have asked it earlier, but it's been a burning question.
Through you to the counselor. Federal gas tax, actually, during the pandemic, they doubled our payment in 2020, let me just quickly look here, sorry, 2021, I believe. 2022, we were back to the normal amount, and then in 2023, the amount's going up from 4.7 million to 4.9, almost 5 million, just a little bit, yeah. But we did get a double payment from the provincial government, yeah, so that's why it's showing 9 million, yeah.
Thank you. I get a motion to receive item 6.2. Councillor Perry, Councillor Ashmore, all in favor? And that's passed. And we get CAO Taylor one more time. As Mr. Hawley can't be with us today, he's under the weather, to do item 6.3, the Development Services 2023 budget. And after we do that, we will break for lunch.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. And obviously, Director Hawley sends his regrets. He's just very ill today, and so couldn't attend. I probably not a bad one to slide into. This department, at least, is near and dear to my heart from my past. But it's actually deep past. It feels like now it's been a little while. So I'd like to walk you through the development services, similar updates for that department. Again, led by Director Hawley, and a focused group on sort of three general areas, being the building and septic division systems, so building code general, and then Part 9 septic program. And that area is led by Suzanne Murchison. I think they're online, our chief building official. And I apologize if I miss anybody. And the Part 9 area is led by Ann Elmhurst in that particular division. Also, economic development falls within development services, and Rebecca Mustard leads that group and is the manager in that area. And then last but not least, the planning division is led by manager Leah Berry, and essentially split into two sort of subsets, sort of being active or current planning, and then policy planning, longer term projects and initiatives. Did I miss anybody online? I see we have a new staff member who's leading the policy division. I'm meeting him for the first time as well. Paul, welcome, and introduced to council. And I think I've covered everybody. So we'll go to the next slide, talk a little bit about what the department does. So looks at leadership, guidance, direction, essentially for sustainable growth and development reviews, considerations, and implementation, and support almost. It's really sort of the entire life cycle of development, if you will, from pre-planning concept, readiness, then you get into sort of active planning and approvals, and then you sort of get into implementation through building, in that division, and then economic development being that ongoing economy support for the city. I mentioned before GIS was formerly a small division in planning, and we've realigned that group and moved them to the IT function. Essentially, it is predominantly a technical sort of function for mapping. Having said that, we then do have specialists sort of throughout The city, mainly one in development services that would remain, as you can appreciate, very much heavily a mapping function there. But our engineering and assets group is another one that has strong skill sets in GIS implementation. So I talked about the three divisions, and so building and septic, essentially they review and process building permits, those septic system, private septic system approvals for all residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional development and construction. And they are the central point of access to liaison or coordinate with those developments. So development charges are collected at that stage for the most part. But again, their sole focus is on reviewing and enforcing permits and applications and approvals through the Ontario Building Code. The CBO is very active in generating building and development stats, and that's legislator required in some cases, so reporting into government agencies, but also to other departments, or as information for us, whether it's just general demographics, growth projections, etc. ECDev, Economic Development, is responsible for all facets of the program. So it would be community programming, broad-based advocacy, small business programs and supports, entrepreneurship, business development, focus on some other areas like arts and culture, curatorial services, agriculture and tourism, and heritage planning. And there's a strong team there as well. And as I mentioned, the planning division, responsible for all considerations and to provide recommendations and advice to you for applications and items under the Planning Act, or sort of large initiatives that will inform how we grow and how we develop into the future. And you've heard of some of them. So things like maintaining and updating our official plan, secondary plans, our zoning bylaws. Now we're starting to almost restart or look at some of the bigger planning considerations. So growth management, what are we going to be looking like after 30 years? And then what are the other considerations involved in that? So whether it's broad-based transportation, active transportation, servicing, all of these things certainly feed into that. And they're not solely done through planning and development staff. It's definitely a team sport in that case. And so many of the departments feed into that sort of longer term planning. So we'll go to the next slide, talk a little bit about previous term and last year's highlights. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the pandemic threw everybody for a loop. So how we delivered and maintained service, it was different. There's no question. There was times when access wasn't available directly by the public, but we had to very quickly shift and receive and accept applications online. We had interactions and meetings similarly. So numbers really didn't, the activity didn't settle down as much as it might have appeared that way. In fact, I would suggest it increased, whether it was some in the development community readying for a post-pandemic state, so wanting to get their approvals in and in place, get some advice, or whether it was just building permits themselves. Again, although they were down a little bit from previous year, they weren't down substantially. And so house renovations, some construction did continue to take place. Some stats, 2020, total permits, 827, about 126 million in construction value. Jump forward to last year, 2022, 1,225 permits, total value, 274 million. So yes, there was a little bit of a downturn in the pandemic, but essentially activity has more than doubled in value, and it's 1.5 times for actual permits. 2020 still had 179 new homes built. 21 was another 613. And in 2022, last year, 538. So you could see an immediate pause. And to give you some perspective, prior to the pandemic, so 2019, maybe 2018, hovering around that 200 mark for average annual housing starts. So the growth is here, it's coming, and I can only see it increasing over time. You've heard from the planning group or development services. It's one area where there was some substantive recruitment challenges and trying to have people, resources in to manage this volume. And so tried to do best efforts, commend the group with the limited sort of resources. They were still able to manage these increasing numbers. And at the same time, turn their minds to starting to onboard and recruit new staff. So we're not finished yet, but I think it's a combination of recruitment and attraction of new staff, but also leveraging and expanding on some contracted services. And you may recall you saw a report, an update, 2 reports, I believe, in the December Council on some of those contracted services that were formalized so that we could find some immediate relief as well. We'll go to the next slide, talk a little bit about economic development. 2022, just some of the accomplishments. The Old Mill Heritage Conservation District study was completed. The Cultural Center feasibility study, phase 1, was completed. Signature Experience Program was kickstarted. Again, I know I'm giving you a lot of sort of names and titles. We will give you in the future some updates on these fantastic programs. Welcome Home Workforce and Business Attraction Marketing Campaign took place, continues. And our downtown revitalization projects, I'll say celebrated, but quite frankly, just ongoing efforts and work. And again, I mentioned it's a team sport. It's not just ECDEV sort of looking to reach out and support maybe small businesses or businesses that were struggling, but it's looking right across the community groups that help and support those downtowns and centers. And it's the people that are coming and visiting, and then it's our own investment. And I think you're going to find it's almost second to none in terms of the last term and this term, where methodically massive infrastructure investments in Lindsay, Fenelon Falls, and now Omemee are really paying dividends for those respective communities. Mentioned the cultural feasibility study, and there was a great group and a community effort to develop that. And I'll mention a little bit later that we'll be getting into phase 2. If we go to the next slide, just a couple of highlights from the planning division. The comprehensive rural zoning bylaw, it's a massive project, as you can appreciate. I mentioned pre-amalgamation, multiple townships, as well as county, but all of those townships had zoning bylaws. And all of them were, or most of them were slightly different. And so it's a long-term effort to try to consolidate those, provide consistency right across the board. But this initiative is well in hand and proposed to be completed at the end of this year. Other very important master plans, because again, although we're doing sort of implementing certain things, if we don't plan and strategize, we won't do it properly. And so we're always updating some strategies or master plans, no exception here. Active transportation is one that is going to be completed this year. And the other massive one or big one is our growth management study and what's related to that. A lot of new training and development. It's been mentioned in other departments for onboarding of new staff. We have had a lot of new staff. There's a lot of new faces in the development services division or department. And so we want to make sure that they're onboarded properly. And just again, ongoing, although, you know, we have tangibles, right? We have applications in development, and they're the ones that we can easily report to you and say, sort of, here's what we're working on. Here's, you know, the tangibles, if you will. The intangibles meet and exceed. People are constantly looking for growth, planning, development, even just small scale advice and guidance. And it's a constant sort of issue to try to resource and properly provide that information, whether it's online, in person, or a combination thereof. Put into that a pandemic and restrictions on how you do that conversation, not just from our perspective, but even restrictions the public was not interested in necessarily, or some, in coming into office spaces and doing that conversation. So we had to leverage technology, find ways to keep the conversations going. And I commend the group up to this point. But again, we're not finished. A lot of more work to do. So we'll go to the next slide. And so I talked about some of the backlog, at least in terms of human resources. So then by extension, applications were starting to, the volume didn't stop. People were still applying for a consent, that's severance, or doing some pre-consultation with the city, minor variances, which again, they're not the most complex or the things that you hear, but they are some of the most important decisions that you make locally for individuals or for smaller considerations. And so we didn't want that backlog to continue to expand, and so looked at a combination of contracted services, bringing in other services, almost thirdly an all hands on deck, everybody sort of pitching in that department and looking at ways to enhance the backlog, if you will, or get out of it. And it was done well. Again, still work to be done. I am quite pleased or confident that in 2023, that backlog is dissipating. And I think if we can continue to leverage some of the things that we put in place and continue to be successful in some of the recruitment, I think we'll be in a good place later this year and for the upcoming building season. The next slide talks to the building and septic division more specifically. So one of the things that was an ongoing project, and again, you can't put these things aside. They're demanded and required, and glad we didn't, because now we're getting into a demand and post-pandemic state where we're going to have substantive growth applications and inquiries. And so in the building area, doing an online portal for building and septic applications will allow developers or individuals to apply online, to track, to communicate better, so that it's not solely reliant on in an in-person. Also to allow our people to manage files and track them online as well. In the last term of council, for example, when there was significant constraints, as you can appreciate, doing house inspections, you going into somebody's personal space to review development, a lot of pandemic constraints on that. And so staff were able to do electronic camera inspections in some cases, coordinated through those individuals. There's an example of a best practice that we want to maintain, but it also allowed, because we were stretching our people thin, now they can update and do certain approvals and updates on permits online directly and in the field potentially. So stay tuned for that. I think that's going to be a fabulous enhancement to that area. And then certainly ongoing training and development. And again, this isn't unique to this department, but as we're looking to be creative in onboarding and recruiting and retaining new people, in some cases we have to go to people that don't have all of the qualifications necessarily, but are a great investment to bring them on and train them sort of within our systems. And so this is one example of what we're doing in the building area, where they may have certain qualifications for inspection and review, and looking at sort of a mentoring program, and then being able to fund and support their other certifications so they can move into permanent inspection roles. So kudos to that group for that approach as well. Quite innovative. Next slide for economic development. Looking ahead this year, want to do a refresh on the economic development strategy. Again, we need to sort of look post-pandemic, look at where we need to put some attention collectively, and then as that division for various resources. A development concierge program. This came out of the last term of council. It was a recommendation from one of the task forces, the Economic Recovery Task Force, was to look at some targeted concierge services so that if a development was sort of delivering priority type development, they would have a single point of contact, could be steered through the department generally, and quite frankly, steered through the municipality to get their required approval. So we want to leverage and expand on that program as well. And then lastly, I mentioned the Cultural Center feasibility study. That was completed last year. Now, phase 2, we'll be looking at the details associated with a potential cultural center in the municipality. So we'll go to the next slide. In the planning area, some of the ongoing want to resolve the remaining secondary plan appeals. So conclude that long-standing project or program. Enhance and expand functionality of the GIS viewer. That'll be in conjunction with IT. Over the last term of council, one of the things that was implemented was a GIS-based viewer for the public. So an online tool. And essentially that is what's being highlighted. It will be an expanded tool that will be on our website and online for the public, community groups, etc. You already know very well, we're deep into understanding Bill 109, Bill 23 changes, Bill 108 to a lesser extent. And so there is some implementation items that legislation has imposed. And so over the coming months and probably the next two quarters, you will be getting specific recommendations and updates on various elements of how we're recommending we respond to these legislation changes. And finally, again, while we're doing the day-to-day in operations, there's always some of those big plans, and I mentioned them, the rural zoning bylaw, growth management, and active transportation. Want to continue and finalize those big projects this year. If we go to the next slide, still a couple more. We want to continue to streamline some of the components in application. So moving towards an electronic application process, not just in the building area that I mentioned, but more broadly in planning. So it allows for similar, you can apply electronically, track the status of your applications, transfer information and documents. So that'll be a big improvement. Quite complex though in nature. There's a lot more considerations in the sort of planning projects, but something that we want to focus on in your term of council. And then just looking more generally, certain policy projects that again are quite important to then feed into where we go forward. So these are the MCR, this is municipal comprehensive reviews of various elements or considerations and growth. So whether it's tree preservation, we want to look at our commercial structure and do a policy review there. Natural heritage, agricultural systems, and our healthy environment plan, implementing ongoing recommendations from that and other respective studies. So again, although it's, the development at the end of the day, you see bricks and mortar, there are so many other considerations, as I know you appreciate. And I'll sort of highlight that of all the sort of functions of, I would say, the 3 levels of government, this is the one area that is unique to municipalities. You are the land use approval authority. Yes, upper levels, province in particular, provide legislation and guidance to work within. But honestly, at the end of the day, these are important local decisions, big and small. So we'll go to the last, talk about budget pressures for the department. Staffing is going to continue to be a pressure. We're going to look at and monitor as we onboard and as we contract some of the work. If there still are gaps, we may be coming to you for some recommendations on resources to make sure that we can keep up with the pace. Going to continue to work with IT to upgrade certain technology. Again, this isn't unique here in this department. It would be all departments, but I think it's an investment well spent to look at how can we leverage technology to improve services ongoing. And you would have heard recently that we moved our community hub down at 180 Kent, so our customer service functionality, you'll hear a bit more about that later, up to City Hall. And the resultant impact was that 180 Kent Street is essentially the development headquarters, if I can say it that way. So it does house all of this department and those functions. We do have an arrangement with the local chamber as well. They are doing some programming work within that building, but we want to now look at ways to expand on that footprint down there, invite development, invite the public back into all of the processes overall, whatever that looks like. And as you heard me say, it'll be a hybrid approach or a combination. We need to make sure they can connect in online and from remote places. They need to be able to connect in person. They need to call and talk to people, so, and everything in between. And a lot of complexities around that, but we'll get there. I think, Mr. Mayor, with that, I'm going to conclude. And again, certainly happy to answer any questions that I can, or I know that the team would be happy to address any questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Warren.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for the presentation. I think one of the biggest projects is the Healthy Environment Plan. And my question is, have we hired a staff for that to make sure it rolls out?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, I guess firstly, I'll share the comment. We certainly took a pause on implementing many of the recommendations in the Healthy Environment Plan. Want to do a refresh. So firstly, I'll say that the expectation is through the policy group, we'll be looking at driving that project through. So I mentioned we have the first staff member that was online with us already. He is the supervisor of policy. So we'll be overseeing that portfolio. But within that group, we still have on the org chart 2 positions. One's a planner to do policy planning work, and one is a healthy environment coordinator. Those are not filled yet, but they are immediate recruitment now. So they will work in that group of 3. I'm hopeful that we will be onboarding those remaining 2 in the first half of this year. Are they in the process though? For sure. We've got job descriptions. We've had a posting for the planner of policy. So we wanted to refresh that. The Healthy Environment Coordinator job posting is going out imminently. But we wanted the manager in place and to be able to do a little bit of work in the background to ready for it. Okay.
Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'd like to thank the CEO for his triple crown of presentations this morning. Just piggybacking on Councillor Warren's comment, I'm really pleased to see that the Healthy Environment Plan does include taking note of the resiliency of our communities and the needs in the face of climate change, which is having a real impact in so many intuitive and counterintuitive ways. Just 2 quick questions, if I could. Staffing considerations for budget pressures. You mentioned that they're pressures. Is that a recruitment and retention pressure? Or do you see it becoming a budgetary financial pressure, or are they one and the same? And the second question would be just around space allocations. You talked already about kind of the new normal coming out of COVID. There are lots of questions around, do we need to be paying rent, for example, on square footage? Are there, scheduling solutions now that working at home more is the new normal? Are there ways to office share and perhaps reduce that bricks and mortar square footage cost of the city's, building imprint? Thank you.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll start with the budget pressure question, and I'll conclude that it's a combination of both, as you had sort of characterized.
Thank you.
It's retaining or looking at these creative contracts. It's also some recruitment. Councillor Warren sort of asked about the Healthy Environment Coordinator. There are certain areas that recruitment is tough right now. There's no question. That's one area. Policy planners, and that area I'm thinking in particular. You're going to hear in other presentations, there are other areas that we're having a lot of difficulty. So again, we need to be creative, do what we can, but at the end of the day, if we are sensing or seeing some shortfalls, it might be an in-year budget pressure, for example. And we hired or asked the previous council to hire another planner sort of late in the budget program, and it was just a product of what the circumstances were at the time. So that's an example. In terms of space planning, although it was flagged here, really was sort of scratching the surface from development services. And it's going to be a question I'm going to answer today, but then I'm going to elaborate at a later date, because we are seeing significant changes in our workplaces and spaces, number one. I mentioned in a previous presentation the alternate work arrangements that we are entering into with staff. And to give you a sort of order of magnitude, we have about 1,200 staff, very much in very different sort of circumstances. Not all work in offices, as you can appreciate. In fact, the majority don't work in offices. But of the less than half that do, about 250 are working from home in some way, shape, or form. Might be a couple days a week, might be something else. So that was just approved late last year. This year we need to monitor it. And you're bang on. We're going to methodically go through each department, see what the net impact is, what's the footprint, and then start to consolidate and rationalize space. That's then, I think, going to lead to major recommendations where we might close buildings, repurpose buildings. But again, we're going to be looking at that over this calendar year.
Great, thanks very much for that.
Okay.
Councillor Ashmore.
Thank you. Through you to CAO. As far as the rural zoning bylaw, I know we started this in 2019. I was at a meeting in Downeyville, and we had the consultant that was there, and I know that we had the pandemic and now it's picking up, but that's something that it's always been frustrating, and I could safely say that everybody around this table in their ward, they have adjacent municipalities. In my example, I have what they call the Four Corners. You have Verlin Township, you have Fenelon Township, you have Ops and Emily, and they're all right in one corner, and within inches of each other, there's different bylaws. So that's what really is frustrating for people. They have to work with different bylaws, and to see that this is going to be coming to fruition, that's great. The second question is the development process. I know that the pre-consultation process, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, there was about 47 entities that you would contact. I think that's now increased up to 55. So there's more entities and people and organizations that you have to go through. But leading into the next question is, we brought in what they call rush fees, and that was supposed to basically put you at the top of the queue. If you pay more for your development, whether it be a small or a medium or large size development, do we prioritize those? Or in other words, there's some smaller developers that really don't have the financial backing of, say, a bigger developer, and they want to get their development going. So hopefully we are still treating every development equally according to their size and their priority.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I guess I'll start by saying I'm very confident that we're going to prioritize all of the developments accordingly. I mentioned we need to do it concurrently too, while we have major, rezoning, official plan applications and so on. The backlog, quite frankly, a lot of it was in sort of the smaller scale development, but important consents, minor variances, and the volumes are much higher in terms of applications. So there's certainly a balancing act. Again, I'm tempering this with my comments about the resources that we had available to us to do best efforts, but we, in some cases, had to prioritize. With respect to your question about rush fees or sort of accelerated fees, I'm actually not aware specifically of that, but I will certainly take that question back as part of the Q&A and make sure that I get a response for you on sort of what we're doing, what scale we would be doing that at, and how we prioritize those.
Thank you. I have a couple. Perhaps to the chief building official. There was an announcement from the provincial government about an internship program for building inspectors. and I know you've made some moves in order to free up building inspection time. I wondered if you'd had a chance to look at that and whether it was something that we could take advantage of.
Okay, to you, Mr. Mayor. The provincial internship program closely mirrors what our provincial association already had, the Ontario Building Officials. The problem with the program is that it is quite onerous. There is a lot of reporting required. We are required to sign up for a minimum 18 months. And for most of the CBOs in Ontario, we're in agreement that it doesn't really help us with our immediate pressures. So what I haven't looked into it only because we've already been doing sort of the same program without making it formal. We underfill with candidates that aren't qualified, and we train them on the job. And that's basically what this internship program does, save and except that there is reporting involved. And like I said, it takes 18 months to get someone to full qualifications, whereas we are able to do it within a 6 to 12 month period doing it ourselves. So we have historically been in a position due to competition with the GTA. So we've always been struggling to find fully qualified candidates. So we're hiring candidates that have minimal 1 or 2 qualifications. Right now, we're actually looking at a candidate that has 0, and trying to consider whether to make that offer and completely train them under our umbrella. So, yeah, to sum it up quickly, I haven't looked at it because on the surface, it's just too onerous.
Thank you. I just wondered, I don't know if it's Adam or Carolyn, can you tell me in this budget what population growth percentage we used?
To the mayor. We use 2% as our population growth throughout the budget.
Are we confident that's fairly accurate, or do we think that it may be low?
I'm thinking it's fairly accurate. We did look at properties and increases in like growth in that regard, and I think 2% is a fairly good estimate.
Thank you. My last question, Mr. CAO. I had heard, I don't know, 15 years or more ago, we did a retail survey that was used in planning and in building to determine where growth should take place. Should we be looking at updating some sort of retail survey, or is it something that happens automatically, or is it something that has to be initiated? Is it fallen out of favor, or what is, I've heard it mentioned a couple of times, and I'm just curious as to its value.
Thanks for the question through you, Mr. Mayor. And I can't believe I got to go back 15 years now, but I don't know if that's aging me. But anyways, it was standard business in planning, particularly to inform things like the official plan, especially in rural settings, population-supported employment. And so retail studies were done. And then when you really got into it and development applications, certainly it was very popular in urban centers where you would actually look at retail capacity, market analysis to inform planning and council decisions. I'd say that the level of detail maybe has gone out of favor in sort of recent years, but it still remains important to inform generally your policy considerations. A lot of our jobs are population supporting jobs, and I mentioned it earlier in the presentation, a commercial study will be done. It's essentially the same thing. It will look at the retail sector, look at some of the other personal services, and again, I'm deliberately using population supporting type jobs, and we'll do an analysis of that, and it will inform multiple things throughout your decision making.
Thank you. No other questions? Can I get a motion to receive item 6.3? Deputy Mayor Richardson, Councillor Perry. All those in favor? And that's passed. I think lunch is supposed to be here up in the Weldon room. So let's go do that, and we'll come back here for 12:45, 12:45. Thanks.